A faint scratching on the porch pulled Marine veteran Marcus Hale out of the silence on that stormy night. When he opened the door, a starving German shepherd was dragging itself toward him, and the moment their eyes met, the past Marcus had buried for 2 long years rose like it had never slept. He didn't yet know the dying dog carried a secret tied to the canine who once saved his life. And that night was only the beginning. Marcus Hale had lived in the old cabin outside Denver long enough for the walls to memorize his silence. The place was built by his grandfather, patched up by his father, and now inhabited by a Marine who walked like a shadow and talked even less. Winter clung to the mountains that year, a dry, biting cold that slipped under doors no matter how tightly they were shut. Marcus didn't mind. The cold felt honest, predictable, unlike the memories that waited for him behind his eyes. Most mornings looked the same. He brewed coffee he barely tasted, sat at the kitchen table, and pretended the world outside had nothing to offer him. His prosthetic leg leaned by the window, untouched, a reminder of a life he used to live and a partner he used to trust with that life. Atlas had been more than a K9. He'd been the last voice Marcus heard before the blast, the last warmth before the dust and fire took everything else. Across the room sat the cedar box. He never moved it, never opened it. It held Atlas's harness, his medal, and that small brass tag with a bite mark right through the middle. Some days Marcus imagined the box whispering his name. Other days he imagined throwing it into the stove. Instead, he did nothing at all. Hank, his neighbor, had become the only man stubborn enough to check on him. A Vietnam vet with a crooked grin and lungs full of old smoke, Hank didn't bother pretending Marcus was fine. He'd just show up, knock his cane on the porch, and say things like, "Kid, you keep living like a ghost, and even the ghosts are going to get bored." Marcus usually answered with a grunt, maybe a nod. That was the rhythm they fell into. One afternoon, as the sky dimmed to the cold lavender of early winter, Hank stopped by with 2 bags of groceries. Marcus tried to refuse them, but Hank shoved past him anyway. "You look thin," he muttered. "You don't need to lose more of yourself." Marcus forced a breath. "I'm not hungry." "I didn't say you were," Hank shot back. They talked a little, mostly Hank talking, Marcus half listening, until Hank finally left, grumbling his way down the snowy steps. The cabin settled into its usual quiet again, a quiet so thick it almost rang. Marcus made his way to the window and sat across from the unopened box. The sun dipped low, turning the frost on the glass into a thin sheet of silver. He wondered, not for the first time, if life was supposed to feel smaller after war, like the world had shrunk down to a chair, a cabin, and memories that circled like wolves just outside the firelight. Then came the noise, a faint scrape, soft but unmistakable. Something brushed the porch, slow, dragging, like weight carried by exhaustion. Marcus stiffened. The sound came again, a weak clawing, almost apologetic. His heart tightened the way it always did before a flashback, but this wasn't inside his head. It was real. He reached for the cane leaning beside the chair. Not a weapon, but it would do. Moving quietly, he opened the door a crack, letting a blade of cold wind cut through the dark. At first he saw nothing but the white fog rolling across the ground. Then the fog shifted. A shape crawled forward. The porch light flickered across a battered German shepherd, ribs showing through matted fur, one ear torn, paws cracked and bleeding. The dog looked up, and Marcus felt something inside him twist hard. There was recognition in those eyes. Not memory. He told himself it couldn't be that, but something deep and knowing, something he hadn't seen in 2 years. The dog tried to stand, failed, tried again. Then its front legs buckled, and it slid forward until its head came to rest on the bottom step, the same step Atlas used to sleep against during night watches. Marcus froze. His hand tightened on the cane, knuckles turning white. The porch swayed. The cold air thinned. For a heartbeat he was back in Syria, dust choking the sky, Atlas's last bark splitting through the roar of the blast. A tremor ran down Marcus's spine, his breath hitched. The dog, barely conscious, lifted one trembling paw and laid it gently against the wooden step. A gesture so familiar, it hurt. Marcus swallowed, his voice breaking into a whisper he didn't plan. "Atlas?" The dog didn't move, didn't even open its eyes. But the quiet, desperate weight of its presence pressed through the cold like a memory resurfacing from the wreckage of the past. Marcus stood there a long time, unable to step forward, unable to turn away, staring at a creature that looked too broken to matter and yet somehow capable of shattering everything he had tried to bury. And for the first time in years, the silence of the cabin shifted. It had company. And Marcus Hale had no idea what to do with that. Marcus didn't remember stepping outside. 1 minute he was staring from the doorway, and the next his boots were sinking into the thin crust of snow on the porch. The cold stung his skin, but it barely registered. All he could see was the battered shepherd lying at his feet, breathing in short, ragged bursts as if the air itself hurt to swallow. Snowflakes gathered on its fur, melting into the mud-caked patches along its spine. "Easy, easy there," Marcus murmured, though his voice shook as if he were the one about to collapse. His breath hung in the air, mixing with the dog's own weak puffs of steam. The world felt painfully still, held by the thin thread between past and present. A door slammed somewhere in the distance, and Marcus flinched hard enough that his cane slipped from his grip. Before his pulse could spiral into another flashback, he heard Hank's voice calling from the yard. "Marcus, you out here?" The beam of an old flashlight jittered along the snow until it landed on the porch. Hank's silhouette appeared through the fog, shoulders hunched, breath wheezing in the cold. "Saw your light on," he said. "Everything." The old man stopped in his tracks when he spotted the shepherd. "Lord above," he whispered. "Where'd he crawl in from?" Marcus didn't answer, didn't trust himself to. He crouched slowly, careful not to startle the animal, though it looked far too exhausted to react. When he reached out, the dog lifted its head a single inch, trying to meet the touch halfway. That tiny effort was somehow worse than if it had snapped or growled. It was the kind of trust only a trained dog would offer, the kind earned through missions and long nights in hostile dirt. Hank knelt beside him with a grunt. "Kid, this dog's freezing. He won't survive the night out here." Marcus swallowed. His throat felt too narrow. "He shouldn't be here at all." "Well," Hank sighed, "life doesn't always check in with our expectations." Together they managed to lift the shepherd, Marcus supporting the front, while Hank steadied the trembling hindquarters. The dog was lighter than it looked, hollow almost, and Marcus felt his ribs under the weight of his hands, each rise of the chest shallow and shaky. The kind of breathing Marcus had heard 100 times from wounded soldiers. He tried not to think about that. Inside the cabin, the warmth hit all three of them in a wave. Hank spread a blanket near the wood stove, and Marcus lowered the dog onto it. The shepherd let out a rough, broken sound, not quite a whine, not quite a sigh. Something caught between pain and relief. Marcus backed away, heart pounding too fast for someone simply standing in a living room. He stared at the dog as though it might vanish, like a mirage conjured by guilt and the winter night. The shepherd's eyes fluttered open, amber, deep, searching, then settled on Marcus as if choosing him. Hank rose slowly, rubbing his stiff knee. "We need to get him to Lila first thing. She'll know what to do." He looked at Marcus, waiting for the man to nod or speak, or give any sign that he was still anchored to the present. Marcus finally managed, "Yeah, morning. She'll be open." He glanced at the dog again, jaw tight. "He's not just lost, Hank. Someone hurt him." "So we find out who," Hank replied gently. "But first we keep him alive." They let the dog rest, filling bowls with water and a bit of chicken Marcus hadn't touched earlier. The shepherd ignored the food, but licked at the water, each movement careful, deliberate, as if the effort might break him. When he finished, he lifted his head and pressed it lightly against Marcus's boot, a soft, exhausted touch, a gesture dogs make when they've chosen their person. Marcus stepped back too quickly, breath catching. That same instinctive gesture had once been Atlas's way of saying, "I'm here, you're safe." Seeing it now felt like being hit behind the ribs. He turned away, staring at the cedar box in the corner. The room suddenly felt too small, too close. He braced his hand against the wall, steadying himself while memories surged like water rising under a door. Behind him, Hank moved quietly, giving the moment the kind of respect only men who've lived long enough to understand grief can manage. "Marcus," he said after a while, voice low, "you don't have to know what this means yet. Sometimes things show up before we're ready." Marcus closed his eyes. I can't go through that again." "You're not," Hank said gently. "This is a different dog." Marcus almost said, "It doesn't feel different," but the words stayed trapped in his chest. Hours slipped by in the soft crackle of the stove. Marcus sat in the old armchair, unable to sleep, but unable to look away from the shepherd. Every so often, the dog opened its eyes, checking the room, checking Marcus, then drifting off again. When dawn finally crept over the mountains, brushing the cabin in pale blue light, the shepherd tried to stand. Its legs buckled immediately, and Marcus was across the room before he realized he'd moved. He caught the dog halfway, easing it back to the blanket. The shepherd leaned into him weakly, its muzzle brushing his palm. Marcus whispered, "Easy, boy." The words left him before he could stop them, soft and instinctive. The dog exhaled a trembling breath and rested its head in his lap. Something loosened in Marcus's chest, painful, unfamiliar, frightening. Not hope exactly, but the shadow of it. Outside, the first real sunlight in days touched the snow. Inside, Marcus Hale sat frozen in place, a starving shepherd asleep against him, and a truth he wasn't ready to face, pressing in from all sides. Whatever this dog was, whoever had trained him, he hadn't crawled through a winter storm by accident. And Marcus's quiet, predictable life had just shifted in a way he could no longer deny. By the time Marcus and Hank pushed open the clinic door the next morning, the sky had shifted from pale gray to the first hints of a coming storm. The bell above the entrance chimed, sharp and too cheerful for Marcus's liking. The smell of antiseptic and dog shampoo filled the room, the kind of scent that didn't bother him but still sent a jolt of memory through his spine. Dr. Lila Brooks looked up from the counter, her hair tied back in a loose knot, glasses perched on the edge of her nose. "Morning, Hank." Then she saw Marcus, then the shepherd in his arms, and her voice softened. "Oh, my. Bring him in. Quickly." Marcus laid the dog onto the stainless steel table. Lila moved with the confidence of someone who had spent years tending to creatures that couldn't explain their pain. She checked the shepherd's paws, his ribs, the patchy fur missing along his flank. She pressed a stethoscope to his chest, her brows pulled together. "How long has he been like this?" she asked. "Found him last night," Hank answered. "Barely made it onto Marcus's porch." Marcus stayed silent. He kept one hand close to the dog head, not touching, but near enough for comfort. The shepherd lifted his gaze to follow Marcus whenever he moved, his amber eyes dark with exhaustion, yet locked on him with alarming focus. Lila reached for a small handheld scanner. "Let's see if he has a chip. Most dogs do these days. She ran the scanner across his shoulder. A sharp beep echoed in the room. Lila frowned. Interesting. This isn't a civilian implant. Hank raised a brow. Meaning? She tapped the screen, confusion giving way to something closer to concern. Meaning this is a military chip, but it's encrypted. 2 layers. She glanced at Marcus. This dog didn't come from anyone's backyard. Marcus felt his chest tighten. Not fear, but recognition. Too much of this dog already felt familiar, like stepping into an old uniform that didn't quite fit, but still carried the weight of memory. Lila connected the scanner to her laptop. Lines of code and numbers streamed across the screen. Whoever put this in him didn't want just anyone to know his history. This is unusual. The shepherd made a quiet sound then, a soft whine that barely rose above a breath. Marcus reached out and rested his palm against the table. The dog shifted his head, touching his nose to Marcus's wrist, as if anchoring himself to a face he somehow knew. Lila froze. Well, that's something. Marcus cleared his throat. What? He's responding to your voice, your presence. That's not normal for a dog in this condition. This is trained behavior. She tilted her head. Has he done anything else? Familiar? Marcus hesitated. Last night, when we lifted him, he put a paw on my leg. He didn't add which leg, nor how his heart nearly broke in two at the gesture. Lila continued typing. Let me get into the encrypted layer. Might take a moment. But the moment was interrupted. The front door swung open, and a woman hurried in, carrying a shivering terrier. She mumbled apologies as she passed them, but Marcus hardly noticed. His attention snapped to the window instead. A black pickup idled across the street. Its engine turned over twice, then it pulled away slowly, too slowly, before disappearing around the corner. Marcus felt a cold flicker run through him. Not paranoia, instinct. Hank noticed his expression. Something wrong? No, Marcus lied. Maybe. Lila glanced briefly toward the glass. Trucks pass through all the time, Marcus. Not that one, he muttered under his breath. Before Hank could press him, the laptop pinged. All right, Lila whispered. I'm in. The room grew still. Even the terrier in the corner quieted, as though sensing the shift. Lila scrolled through the file, eyes widening. This dog, his designation is Echo 9, assigned under the Legacy Breeding Project. Marcus blinked. Legacy what? A specialized program, not public, designed to preserve elite K9 bloodlines for future service. She looked up slowly. Marcus, do you remember your old dog Atlas's classification? His stomach dropped. Yes. Lila clicked another tab. Echo 9's lineage file is partially redacted, but his sire, his father, is listed as K9 Atlas H12. The words hung between them, fragile and heavy all at once. Hank swallowed. You mean? Lila nodded. This dog is Atlas's son. The room tilted. Marcus reached for the edge of the table to steady himself. He hadn't heard Atlas's name spoken aloud in 2 years. Hearing it now felt like reopening a wound he'd spent countless nights trying to sew shut. The shepherd, Echo 9, lifted his head slightly, as if sensing the shift inside Marcus. He nudged Marcus's hand again, gentle but purposeful. Marcus's throat tightened. Why would he end up like this? Who would do this to him? That, Lila said quietly, is the part that worries me. She zoomed into the medical history. He was transported 6 months ago with a litter of other young K9s. The transport file ends abruptly. No arrival record. That usually means theft, mishandling, or... She trailed off, her expression darkening. Black market buyers. Marcus tensed. Who would steal trained K9s? People who want control, Lila replied softly. And profit. Outside, another engine rumbled past the clinic. Slow, intentional, watching. Marcus's instincts snapped alert. Echo 9 lifted his head and growled, low and warning. Lila stepped back, eyes narrowing. "Someone's looking for him," she murmured, "and they're not looking with good intentions." For the first time in months, Marcus felt something sharper than grief, something alive, protective, fierce, a spark he thought he'd buried with Atlas. He rested a steady hand on Echo 9's neck. "Then they're going to have a problem," he said quietly, "because they're not taking him." Marcus had never been a man easily rattled, but as he drove the old truck back toward the cabin with Hank beside him and Echo 9 lying weakly in the back seat, something gnawed at him in a way he hadn't felt since the desert. Lila's words stayed with him like an echo he couldn't quiet. Someone's looking for him, someone who knows exactly what he's worth. Worth. Marcus hated that word when tied to an animal who'd already suffered more than any living thing should. Echo 9 shifted, letting out a soft grunt of discomfort, and Marcus checked the rear view. Those amber eyes watched him again, steady despite the pain. The dog wasn't afraid. He was waiting. For what? Marcus didn't know. The truck rattled down the narrow mountain road. Snow flurries drifted like thin white threads across the pavement, hinting at the storm rolling in from the west. Hank finally broke the silence. "You saw that truck too, didn't you? Not the type that comes up here unless they're lost?" Marcus didn't look away from the road. He wasn't lost. "No," Hank agreed. "He was scouting." Marcus gripped the steering wheel harder. He'd learned to trust his instincts. They'd kept him alive in places where the ground itself wanted him dead. And that quiet dread creeping up his spine now? That was instinct screaming that something was coming, something mean and patient. They reached the cabin just as the sun dipped behind the ridge. Marcus carried Echo 9 inside, setting him gently near the fireplace. The shepherd let out a low exhale and curled into the blanket Marcus spread beneath him. He kept one eye on the door, as if guarding even in weakness. Hank stoked the fire, shaking his head. "I don't like this, kid. That dog didn't show up by chance. Someone brought him to the edge of this mountain, and he crawled the rest of the way." Marcus crouched beside Echo 9, brushing a hand along the dog's side. "He came because he had nowhere else left to go." Or, Hank said quietly, "because the folks who lost him are willing to tear this county apart getting him back." Before Marcus could reply, Echo 9's ears flicked sharply. He lifted his head and stared at the front window. His body stiffened. A soft warning rumble built in his chest. Marcus rose and moved to the window, pulling the curtain a half-inch aside. The forest outside had begun to darken, pine branches shifting in the wind like restless arms. At first he saw nothing. Then headlights glowed faintly through the trees. Not moving, just idling, watching. Marcus felt the old tension settle into his shoulders, the kind that had him checking exits and counting heartbeats overseas. "They're here," he muttered. Hank stepped beside him, peering through the gap. "Well, that ain't the mailman." The vehicle's lights shut off. The forest swallowed everything whole again. Marcus backed away from the window. "Hank, go home. Lock your doors." "Not a chance," Hank said, voice firm. "If trouble's coming, better it sees 2 old war dogs than 1. Marcus didn't argue. There wasn't time. Echo 9 rose shakily, pushing himself upright despite the tremor in his legs. Marcus knelt beside him. "You're not ready for this," he whispered. But the dog stood anyway, head lifted, eyes sharp. Even worn down by hunger and wounds, he carried himself like he was trained to protect what he loved. It struck Marcus deep, a memory of Atlas stepping in front of him during gunfire, fearless and steady. Hank moved toward the door. "Lights. Out," he said, flipping the switch. The cabin dropped into shadow, the fire the only remaining glow. They waited in the quiet, the kind of quiet that had a pulse of its own. Then came the crunch of boots on frozen ground. Marcus held up a hand, motioning Hank to stay back. Echo 9 crept forward, his body low, a soft growl vibrating through the room. A knock rapped against the door, 3 hard strikes. Not friendly, not hesitant. A man's voice followed. "Evening. We're looking for a dog. Big shepherd. Ran off from our training facility. Figured he might have wandered up this way." Marcus didn't move, didn't answer. The voice on the porch didn't sound like anyone searching for a lost pet. It had the clipped, irritated tone of someone who believed they were entitled to what they wanted. Another knock, harder. "Sir, we don't want any trouble. Just want to take back what's ours." Marcus stepped closer to the door, keeping his voice level. "You should leave." A low chuckle seeped through the wood. "He's valuable. You have any idea what a dog like that goes for?" A pause. "Didn't think so." Echo 9 growled again, deeper this time. Marcus rested a hand on the dog's back, steadying the tremble that wasn't fear but controlled fury. Hank tightened his grip on his cane, his jaw set. "You folks have a nice night," the man said finally, voice slipping into something colder. "Storm's coming. Roads get dangerous. Hate to hear something happen to this little cabin." Footsteps faded into the snow. The truck engine roared to life a moment later, then rolled away down the mountain road. Marcus didn't exhale until the sound disappeared completely. Hank wiped a hand over his face. "They'll be back, and next time they won't be so polite." Marcus nodded. "I know." Echo 9 rested his head against Marcus's leg, eyes still fixed on the door. Marcus stroked the dog's neck gently. "You came here for a reason, didn't you?" he murmured. The shepherd didn't move, but something in his gaze tightened, as if he understood every word. Outside, the wind picked up, sweeping through the pines with a long, low howl. The storm was gathering, and so was the trouble Echo 9 had dragged with him. The past wasn't done with any of them, not yet. Marcus barely slept. Every time the wind rattled the cabin siding, he jolted awake, half expecting the black truck to return. Echo 9 lay near the bed, too alert for a dog in his condition. Every small sound made him lift his head, ears twitching, body tensing, as if preparing to defend a man he had known for less than a day. The loyalty was unsettling, not because Marcus didn't want it, but because he'd buried that kind of bond 2 years ago and never meant to dig it up again. By morning, the sky had turned the flat gray of a heavy snowfall. Hank showed up before sunrise with 2 mugs of coffee and the grim look of someone who'd spent the night staring out. His window. "Storm's coming fast," he said. "If you need supplies or help, you call." Marcus only nodded. Words felt like an unnecessary burden this early. Hank crouched to scratch Echo 9's head. The shepherd inhaled sharply, but didn't pull away. "There you go, boy," Hank murmured. "You're safe here." Marcus wished he believed that. The man from the night before hadn't been bluffing. People like that didn't knock once and give up. They circled back. They watched. They waited for the moment someone dropped their guard. After Hank left, Marcus fed Echo 9 soft pieces of chicken. The dog ate slowly, but with genuine hunger, licking Marcus's fingers afterward. Something warm tightened in Marcus's chest. He forced himself to stand, grabbing his coat. "We're going back to Lila," he said. "There's more we need to know." Echo 9 followed him to the door, limping but determined. The drive into town was quiet, except for the drone of the heater and the occasional low grunt from Echo 9 when the truck hit a bump. Snow had begun to fall in earnest, thick flakes sticking to the windshield. Marcus's mind kept circling back to one impossible truth. This dog was Atlas's son. He had tried for so long to bury that part of his life that hearing the name again felt like someone had reached into his chest and twisted. Atlas had been the best soldier he'd ever known, fur or not, brave, disciplined, steady under fire. Losing him had torn something Marcus hadn't known how to mend. They reached the clinic just as Lila finished sweeping snow from the steps. She waved him in immediately. "I'm glad you came," she said, ushering them inside. "I dug deeper into Echo 9's file last night. There's more you should hear." Marcus helped Echo 9 lie on a blanket while Lila pulled up the documents again. Lines of redacted text filled the screen, but enough remained visible to paint a picture Marcus didn't want to see. "Atlas didn't die instantly," Lila said gently. "He survived the explosion long enough to be pulled from the field. He was stabilized, barely, and transferred to a base hospital. He was injured beyond recovery, Marcus, but before they euthanized him, they—" She hesitated. "They what?" Marcus whispered. "They used him for a single breeding." Her voice remained soft, but the truth hit like a blow. "A controlled pairing with a female K9 from the same elite bloodline. They were trying to preserve what Atlas had. His instincts, his courage, his intelligence. It was a military decision, not a humane one." She sighed, shaking her head. "Echo 9 is the pup from that pairing." Marcus closed his eyes. A memory surfaced. Atlas sitting beside him during the long nights, head leaned against his shoulder, eyes bright even after hours of patrol. "He didn't deserve to end like that." "No," Lila said, "but he gave this dog a chance to exist. And Echo 9 found his way back to a Marine. That has to mean something." Before Marcus could respond, the clinic bell chimed again. A middle-aged woman entered, carrying a cat crate, shivering snow from her coat. Lila excused herself to help, leaving Marcus alone with his thoughts. He knelt beside Echo 9, his fingers brushing the dog's collar. "You came all this way," Marcus murmured. "Across mountains, through God knows what? You shouldn't even be alive." Echo 9 lifted his head and nudged Marcus's chin, a quiet reassurance so reminiscent of Atlas that Marcus had to steady himself. "You're not him," Marcus said softly, "but you're his blood. That's enough." The woman with the cat finished her appointment and left. Lila returned, wiping her hands on her lab coat. "There's more," she said, crossing her arms. Echo 9 wasn't just lost. According to the transport report, the vehicle carrying the pups was intercepted. 2 handlers were injured, 1 dog killed. The rest vanished. If Echo 9 was found near you, someone deliberately brought him into this area. Marcus frowned. "You think they dumped him near my place?" "No," Lila replied. "I think he escaped and came to you." Marcus blinked. "Dogs don't come to people they've never met." She held his gaze. "Unless his training and his bloodline made him seek out the kind of handler he was bred for. He knew what you were just by being near you." A chill crawled through Marcus, something between awe and heartbreak. Lila continued. "Whatever happened to the others, someone out there wants him back, and not for anything good." Marcus rubbed a hand across his face. "They came last night." Lila's eyes widened. "Here?" "They knocked on my door." He recited the words, calm but cold. "Said he was theirs, that he was valuable. I told them to leave." "And they actually did?" she asked. "For now." Lila exhaled sharply. "Marcus, you need to be careful. If they're part of the trafficking scene I've heard rumors about, they won't just walk away." Echo 9 shifted suddenly, ears pricking. A low growl pulsed in his throat. Not fear. Warning. Marcus stood and checked the window. A black pickup rolled slowly past the clinic, its windows so tinted he couldn't see inside. Snow whirled around the tires as the truck eased down the street, lingering a moment before continuing on. Lila swallowed. "Was that?" "Yes," Marcus answered. Echo 9 struggled to stand, ignoring the weakness in his legs. Marcus steadied him. "Easy, you're safe." Lila watched the dog closely. "He doesn't believe that," she whispered. "And maybe he's right." Marcus felt something shift inside him, a hardening resolve he hadn't felt since the battlefield. Echo 9 had crawled through misery to reach him. Atlas's blood had carried this dog across impossible distance. Someone wanted to reclaim him, to use him, to break him. No, not again, not another dog under his watch. Marcus rested a hand firmly on Echo 9's neck. "They're not taking him," he said, voice low and certain. Lila nodded. "Then you'd better be ready for what comes next." The snow outside thickened, wind climbing into a long, hollow moan. A storm building in the sky. Trouble building on the ground. And for the first time in years, Marcus Hale wasn't planning to run from either. The snow began falling harder as Marcus and Echo 9 made their way back up the mountain road. The truck crawled along the narrowing pavement, tires crunching through the growing drifts. Echo 9 lay in the back seat, dozing but alert enough that his ears flicked at every shift in the wind. Marcus kept glancing in the mirror, not for the dog's sake, but for the black pickup he felt certain would eventually appear behind them. It never did, but the feeling didn't fade. By the time they pulled into the cabin's drive, the sky had turned the color of steel. Snow swept sideways, carried by a wind sharp enough to sting the skin. Hank was already waiting on the porch, bundled in his old army jacket, leaning on his cane. "Storm's rolling in faster than the forecast said," he called out. "Gonna be a rough one." Marcus lifted Echo 9 from the truck, careful of the dog's ribs. "How bad?" "Bad enough that the county sent an alert. Flooding, whiteout conditions, maybe even a landslide if the ground gives." Hank eyed him, his voice lowering. "Storms like this bring trouble out of cracks. You know that." Marcus did. He'd felt it all morning. Inside, the cabin walls shuddered as the wind pressed against them. Marcus spread thick blankets near the fireplace and laid Echo 9 down. The shepherd rested his head on Marcus's knee, breathing slow but steady. The connection between them, new but somehow ancient, made Marcus's chest tighten. He'd carried this kind of responsibility before. Last time, it ended under rubble and smoke. Marcus forced the thought away. "You're safe here," he whispered. Echo 9 blinked once, as if believing him meant something real. Hank shuffled around the kitchen, checking candles, flashlights, and the old radio. "Storm like this, power's going out sooner or later. You got the backup heater ready?" "Already set," Marcus answered. Hank hesitated, his eyes drifting toward the door. "You think they'll come back tonight?" Marcus didn't pretend not to understand. "Yes." Hank exhaled slowly. "Then we prepare." For the next hour, they secured everything they could. Hank nailed boards against the drafty side windows. Marcus checked the locks, the generator, the snow shovel leaning beside the back door. Every so often, Echo 9 let out a low rumble, not directed at anything specific, just the sound of a dog sensing a world shifting into danger. The storm hit full force by mid-afternoon. Snow hammered the cabin roof. Wind screamed through the pines like distant artillery. Marcus built another. Fire, but the warmth barely softened the rising cold creeping through the logs. Echo 9 struggled to stand, wobbling on weak legs. Marcus eased him back down. "Not yet," he murmured. "Save your strength." Hank poured 2 mugs of black coffee and handed one to Marcus. "I radioed the ranger station," he said. "Lines are jammed. Lots of folks reporting flooding already down the valley." Marcus nodded. "It's going to get worse." A sudden thud hit the side of the cabin, heavy, sharp, and wrong. Echo 9 shot up, hackles raised, a growl rumbling out of him like thunder. Marcus grabbed his cane and moved toward the window. Hank's hand caught his arm. "Don't stand in front of the glass." Marcus paused, then crouched low and peeked through the corner of the curtain. Snow swirled in thick sheets, blurring shapes and shadows. At first he saw nothing but the storm. Then a figure moved along the tree line. A man with a hood pulled low, bracing himself against the wind. He leaned close to something, a tree, a marker. Marcus couldn't quite see. A moment later, he disappeared back into the storm. Marcus pulled away, pulse quickening. "Someone's out there." Hank swallowed. "Not a storm to be hiking in?" "They're not hiking," Marcus said quietly. "They're watching." Another sound split through the cabin before Hank could respond, metal snapping, wood cracking. They both turned toward the back door just as a gust slammed into it hard enough to shake the hinges. Echo 9 barked, the sharp, commanding sound of a trained dog issuing a warning. Marcus steadied him. "Easy." But the storm didn't give them space to breathe. The wind roared so violently that snow blasted through the gaps of the old siding. The ground trembled beneath the cabin, just once, but enough to rattle the plates in the cupboard. Hank went pale. "That wasn't wind." "No," Marcus said. "It wasn't." He could feel it in the floorboards, the subtle shift of a mountain soaking too much water, the soil loosening along the ridge behind the cabin. A warning from the earth itself. Hank limped toward the back window. "The drainage pipe on my place feeds into the gully behind here. If it cracks—" Another crack sounded outside, louder this time. Echo 9 whined and limped toward the sound, his body taut with instinct. Marcus blocked him gently. "You stay here. You're in no shape to be running into this." Hank grabbed his coat. "I'll check the pipe. If it's clogged or busted, it'll flood your place first. We gotta fix it now before it turns into a river." Marcus shook his head. "You're not going out in that." But Hank was already at the door, stubborn as any veteran who'd survived far worse. "I don't need your permission, kid. I've been patching that pipe since you were in high school." The wind shoved inside as he opened the door. Snow slapped across the floor. Before Marcus could argue again, Hank stepped into the storm and vanished into the white blur. Marcus stood frozen for a second, torn between chasing after him and staying with Echo 9. Another tremor moved beneath the cabin, longer this time. The ridge behind the property was groaning under the weight of the storm. Echo 9 staggered to his feet again, staring at the door Hank had disappeared through, tail low, body shaking. Marcus knelt beside him. "I know," he whispered. "We should have stopped him." Lightning flashed across the mountains, followed by a crack of thunder that rolled like the sky splitting open. The storm was no longer just weather. It was a force capable of burying everything in its path. Marcus grabbed his coat and shoved his arms through the sleeves. "I'm going," he told Echo 9. "Stay, I'll bring him back." Echo 9 barked once, sharply, defiantly, then limped toward the door, blocking Marcus's path. Marcus knelt, pressing his forehead gently against the dog's. "You can't protect me out there? Not like this?" The dog whined, leaning into him. Marcus closed his eyes. "I need you alive." He stood and pushed out into the storm, cane planted deep into the snow with each step. The wind almost knocked him sideways. Visibility vanished. The cabin behind him blurred into nothing. Somewhere ahead, Hank was out there alone, old bones fighting against weather, strong enough to break younger men. Marcus forced himself forward, one step at a time, the storm swallowing him whole. Whatever danger Echo 9 had dragged into their lives was real, but it wasn't the threat pressing in now. The mountain itself was shifting. And Marcus Hale knew with a clarity sharp enough to cut that he was walking straight into a night that would push every wound, old and new, to its breaking point. Marcus had been through sandstorms overseas that swallowed men whole, but this mountain storm felt different, more personal, more dangerous. Snow hammered his face with the sting of gravel. The wind shoved against him with such force that his cane nearly slipped from his grip. Visibility dropped to nothing, just a churning white wall and the faint outline of trees bending under the weight of the storm. "Hank!" he shouted, though the wind shredded the name before it left his mouth. He kept moving, leaning into the storm, scanning the ground for footprints. The snow filled them almost instantly, but he found the faintest depressions where Hank's boots had pushed through minutes earlier. Marcus followed the trail down the slope toward the drainage ditch that separated their properties. Another tremor rippled beneath his feet. Stronger this time, the earth groaned, the sound deep and unsettling, like the mountain exhaling through clenched teeth. Marcus quickened his pace. A dark shape lay ahead, half buried in the growing drift. "Hank!" He stumbled forward, dropping to his knees. Hank was sprawled on his side, one hand gripping the shattered remains of a Yose metal pipe, the other pressed to his chest. His face was pale, twisted in pain, snow settling into the creases of his jacket. Marcus rolled him gently, checking his pulse. It throbbed, weak, but there. Hank tried to speak, but only a rasp came out. Pipe gave way. Water's flooding. Marcus looked around. The ditch behind Hank churned with muddy water overflowing from the broken line. If the current built up any more pressure, it would pour down toward the cabin, or worse, shift the weakened slope again. "We're getting you inside," Marcus said, hooking his arms under Hank's shoulders. Hank shook his head faintly. "Leg don't work." "You let me worry about that." Marcus dragged him up the hill inch by inch, fighting both gravity and the storm. Every step sent a jolt of pain up his stump, where the cold bit straight to the bone. He braced himself, gritted his teeth, and kept pulling. Once his footing slipped, and they slid several feet downhill, snow cascading around them. Marcus dug his cane into the ground, anchoring them. "Don't kill yourself," Hank gasped. "Too late," Marcus muttered, hauling him up again. By the time they reached the backside of the cabin, Marcus was nearly spent. His breath came out in painful bursts, and sweat froze along his hairline. The ground trembled again, and this time the sound of splintering wood erupted from the garage wall. The landslide had reached the structure. "Hank, we have to move, now." He dragged the older man toward the garage door, but before he could reach it, the remaining section of retaining wall gave out with a deafening crack. Mud and snow slammed into the side of the building, knocking the door inward. The force knocked Marcus back, and Hank rolled from his grasp, slipping down into the dark gap created by the collapse. "Hank!" Marcus lunged after him, grabbing Hank's jacket before he fell deeper. The earth continued sliding, water surging through the broken wall, filling the space below. The storm roared louder, drowning out thought. Hank clutched Marcus's arm weakly. "Leave me! You can't!" Marcus glared at him. "Don't tell a Marine what he can't do." But the truth struck fast and brutal. Marcus was losing ground. His strength was bleeding away. The water level was rising around Hank's legs, icy and fast. Suddenly, a bark cut through the storm. Marcus twisted around. Echo 9 stood at the back door, shivering, soaked, injured, but upright. The shepherd limped forward, eyes locked on Marcus with fierce determination. Marcus shook his head desperately. "Go back inside. You can't be out here." Echo 9 ignored him, moving closer even as the wind nearly toppled him. He pressed his body against Marcus's side, offering the only anchor he had left. Marcus leaned into him, using the dog's weight to keep his balance as he pulled Hank free from the collapsing slope. Together, man and dog, they dragged Hank toward the garage, slipping through the crooked doorway just as another wave of mud slammed behind them. Inside, the garage was a half-collapsed skeleton. Broken boards, cinder blocks, and tools floated in the rising water. Marcus lowered Hank onto a mound of old blankets and lumber that hadn't been swallowed yet. Echo 9 stood guard beside him, trembling but refusing to sit. Marcus checked Hank's pulse again. "Stay with me. You hear me?" Hank nodded weakly before his head drooped. A groaning noise echoed above them, wood straining under the shifting hillside. Water surged again, climbing Marcus's thighs. The only exit behind them was now fully blocked. Marcus knew the truth then. If they didn't get help fast, the entire structure would cave in. No amount of strength or training would save them. He looked at Echo 9. The shepherd met his eyes, ears pinned back, tail low, waiting for command. Atlas used to look at him the same way, ready to run into fire if told. Marcus swallowed hard. He placed both hands on Echo 9's cheeks, pulling the dog close. "Listen to me," he whispered over the roar of the storm. "I need you to go. Find people. Bring help." Echo 9 whined, shaking his head, pressing closer as if refusing to leave. Marcus hardened his voice, shifting into the tone he hadn't used since command days. "Echo 9, go. That's an order." The shepherd froze. Training battled instinct inside those amber eyes. Marcus felt the hesitation like a knife, but he didn't let himself break. Echo 9 turned slowly toward the narrow ventilation shaft near the ceiling, small, rusted, the only possible exit. The water was nearly high enough for Marcus to reach it. He scooped Echo 9 up despite the dog's protest and pushed him upward. "Go," Marcus whispered again, voice cracking. "Please, bring them." Echo 9 gave a final look, one that held history, bloodline, and trust, and squeezed through the gap into the screaming storm beyond. Marcus sagged back into the rising water, chest heaving. Hank lay beside him, unconscious, the frigid current creeping higher around them. The storm raged. The walls trembled. And somewhere out there, a battered German shepherd ran into the blinding white night to save the only family he had left. Done. Echo 9 vanished into the storm as if the night swallowed him whole. For one suspended moment, Marcus could still hear the scrape of his paws on the snow outside. Then even that sound was gone, replaced by the rising roar of water rushing into the garage. Marcus braced himself beside Hank, pulling the older man higher onto the pile of broken boards as the freezing water crept toward their chests. The wind shook the beams overhead, each groan of the wood a reminder that time was slipping away. His breath steamed in the cold, every inhale sharp enough to sting. He rested a trembling hand on Hank's shoulder. "Stay with me, old man," Marcus whispered. "You're not going on my watch." Hank stirred once, mumbling something Marcus couldn't hear, and then went still again. Marcus looked up at the collapsed ceiling, at the darkness above, and for the first time in years he prayed, not with words, but with a raw ache in his chest. Not for himself, for Hank, for that dog out in the storm, for a miracle that felt too much to ask. Minutes dragged like hours. The water crept higher. The cold burrowed deep into Marcus's bones, numbing everything below his ribs. He forced himself to stay awake, to breathe slowly, to listen for any sound that wasn't wind or water. When fatigue threatened to pull him under, he gripped Hank tighter. "Not yet," he murmured. "We hold the line a little longer." Then, faint at first, a distant sound broke through the storm. A horn. Marcus's eyes snapped open. Another horn blast followed, louder this time. Echo 9 had found someone. The next noise was the grind of metal on metal as a vehicle fought its way up the icy road. Voices shouted through the storm, muffled but urgent. Floodlights cut through the cracks in the garage wall, casting long beams of white light that danced across the rising water. Someone pounded on the outside wall. "We have visual on 2 victims," a man yelled. "Saw line, move!" The sound of a gas-powered rescue saw roared to life, filling the garage with sparks as a section of the upper wall was cut away. Chunks of wood and concrete rained down. Cold air poured in, but for once Marcus welcomed it. It meant help had arrived. A pair of strong hands reached through the opening, followed by a helmeted face streaked with snow. "We've got you," the rescuer called out. "Hold on just another second." Marcus shoved Hank upward first. It took 3 rescuers to haul him through the opening, his limp body disappearing into the bright beam of floodlights outside. When it was Marcus's turn, he felt his strength finally give out. His arms trembled violently as he reached upward, water slapping against his chin. But the rescuers grabbed him, pulling with practiced force, and in one rough heave he was lifted out of the darkness and into the freezing night. He collapsed on the wet ground, coughing water from his lungs. Floodlights glared overhead, turning the storm into a swirl of gold and white. Medics swarmed Hank, checking his vitals, wrapping him in heat blankets. Marcus tried to sit up, but his body was shaking too hard. Then something warm and heavy landed against his chest. Echo 9. The dog pressed his face to Marcus's neck, whimpering in relief. His fur was soaked, his sides heaving from the run he'd made through the mountains. Marcus wrapped both arms around him, burying his face in the dog's thick coat as tears finally broke loose. "You did it," he whispered. "You brought them." Echo 9 licked his cheek, tail thumping weakly. A firefighter approached, shaking his head in disbelief. "That dog led us right to you. He blocked our truck until we followed him up the ridge. Smartest damn shepherd I've ever seen." Marcus smiled through the cold and the exhaustion. "Yeah," he murmured. "He comes from a good line." Hank was lifted onto a stretcher, conscious enough now to wave a shaky hand at Marcus. "Told you, storm'd bring trouble," he croaked. Marcus let out a breath that sounded almost like a laugh. In the days that followed, news of the rescue spread through the small mountain town. The sheriff apprehended Duke and Mason Crowell, thanks in part to Echo 9's tracks leading straight past a set of stolen crates. The brothers were charged with trafficking military animals, and no one in town shed a tear over it. When the medics cleared Hank and patched Marcus's injuries, life settled into a slow, healing rhythm again. Except this time, Marcus didn't walk through it alone. Echo 9 stayed at his side everywhere he went, resting his head on Marcus's knee when he sat, sleeping beside his bed at night, and watching the door like he expected danger at any moment. Weeks later, after the mountain thawed, after the cabin was repaired, after Echo 9 regained his strength, Marcus stood in the training yard behind a newly hung wooden sign, Echo Ridge K9 Recovery Center. Hank sat nearby in a rocking chair, wrapped in a quilt, still recovering but grinning like he owned the place. Lila stood with a clipboard, organizing the first group of veterans who had come seeking companionship, healing, or maybe just a reason to keep going. Marcus tightened the strap of his prosthetic and took one steady step forward, then another. Echo 9 walked beside him, shoulder-brushing his leg, guiding his balance with effortless intuition. The veterans watched in a respectful hush, not at Marcus's steps, but at the bond between man and dog. Marcus stopped, resting a hand on Echo 9's back. "I thought I lost my partner forever," he said quietly, voice carrying across the yard. "Turns out, he sent me another one." Echo 9 leaned into him, tail swaying gently. Beyond them, the mountains stood quiet and strong again, washed clean by the storm that had nearly taken everything, and somehow given Marcus a second life in return. And for the first time in years, Marcus Hale felt whole. Not because he'd escaped the darkness, but because something loyal and fierce had led him back into the light. If this story touched you even a little, feel free to drop a simple 0 or 1 in the comments. It's an easy way to let us know you're here, listening, and sharing this quiet corner of the world with us. And if you'd like to hear more stories about courage, loyalty, and the dogs who walk beside us, make sure to subscribe. There are many more journeys waiting for you.